And welcome aboard the Silver Spirit. My name is Richard Heyman. I'm your destination lecturer, and I'm traveling with you on this great trip to Norway, which is, if you've been there before, you know how remarkable it is, and we're going to have a great trip to see the capital and some small towns, some fjords, and many things. And it's a great experience having been in Norway many times, working on ships. I've been a sea captain and a mariner and worked on all kinds of vessels. But after many years and many ships, this is my favorite. Maybe it's the room service. But anyway, I just before I start, I'm traveling with my grandson from our home state. Stand up, Pemba, giveaway. So he's my fact checker. He told me, Grandpa, you really should know what you're talking about. Gee, I never heard that before. But anyway, he lives in New Mexico where I was born. But I went to, I guess because I was a bit of a Norseman born in the desert, I just had to go to sea. And so I've come here and I've had a long life working around the world. But Norway is a particularly spectacular place and sort of one of the home countries of true mariners, I'd say. So I'm going to show you something about the ports. We're going to Olden, Molde, and Trondheim, and then some of the traditional heritage of the Norse culture, which is what makes Norway so interesting in some ways. And of course, it's a very modern country now. It's the Viking days are long gone, and now most Vikings, have self-driving cars and drones and things like that, making life a little easier back. So we just don't row like we used to do. But anyway, I'm just going to show you some things about Norway. First of all, it is just north of the continent of Europe and the UK. And this sat picture shows you the winter conditions, which are, let's say, a remnant of the Ice Age, because the entire Scandinavian peninsula was gripped in mile deep ice for so many millennia that when the Ice Age retreated, let's say 15,000 years ago, the land has actually been rising. So where you go and see all these mountains, they are picking up and getting taller measurably every year. But this is part of the great peninsula of Scandinavia, Sweden, Finland. You can see how vast it is. And because of the difficulty of getting over the mountains in the days when you had to hike and the sea was too treacherous, Norway developed its own small isolated communities and then finally became a kingdom under King Olaf, who will visit his tomb in Trondheim. And then it had various history of being ruled by the Swedes or the Danes, but now is a proudly independent kingdom, a constitutional republic. But we're going up from the south up first to Westland, which is the province of Norway, which has all these fantastic fjords. And we'll be going in the Northern Fjord and then up later to Olden, and we'll see plenty of mountains and sea. And so the characteristic of the fjord, when in English we use that term, is that it had been a river valley or even a lake, but when the seas rose after the Ice Age, it flooded all these valleys, making for the spectacular scenery we have. So we'll be going first to Olden, which is right there on the lower right side of the chart here, and then we'll come back out and go up to Molde, which is some further up north. But as you enter a fjord, it's often scattered islands and then a broad valley, but as you go inland, it gets steeper because you're going right up into the crest of the mountains. Most of the mountains are only about 3,500 meters high. They're not so high and jagged like, let's say, the Alps are, because they had an ice shelf that graded over the whole place for so long that it's almost like a plateau up on the top. But this is our first port called Olden, and this is one of the hundreds of little towns that are stuck up in the fjords, and now they have modern transport. But you can see in the olden days, you better travel around by boat because you could get around the mountains, go up the valley. Otherwise, a lot of the land is almost impassable until they built tunnels and roads and, of course, modern conveniences. And this is the original home of what we call the Vikings, which is a period about 750 to 1000 when the residents in little towns like this would go out A Viking is actually a verb. A Viking is Vik is a bay, and to go Viking is to go bay to bay. And in the summertime, they would go off trading and maybe raiding, and of course they went all through Europe raiding and trading. But I'll go into that heritage a bit more. But just up in these various fjords in the Westland, they're the remnants of the early civilization going back thousands of years. But this is one of the first of the Christian Benedictine monasteries up near Olden. That is a historic site. In the town itself, you have various periods of current churches. This is one in Olden also. The town is very small. You can walk around it, but the reason we go here is because you can get up into the highlands, you can go for a hike, go on a rib ride. There's all kinds of excursions that the concierge can show you if you haven't already booked things. I'm talking about the general background rather than the actual excursions off the ship. But if you are on your own, you can just walk around and get a flavor of a little town in this isolated part of Norway. Nowadays, in the summer, it's full of even Norwegians go on the holiday and go to these places and stay. They may be from Oslo or the bigger cities, but it seems like everybody in Norway is on holiday. Any Norwegians on the ship? No. Good, bra. So you can be my fact checker. But in this town, like this is in Molde, every town seems to have a new stadium and new roads. I mean, Norway has turned from a very isolated and poor country to one of the most developed and prosperous because of the oil industry and tourism also. So that the old is very much contrasted by a lot of new construction, which particularly when I talk about Oslo, I'll show you some of the modernization of the city and the countryside. But meanwhile, we're going to come up to Molde right here, which is not far in. It's near Olden, which is, Olden, yes, I know it's there. There it is. As you see, I'm a professional navigator with a laser. Anyway, Olden will be visiting on the way back from Trondheim, the beautiful Art Deco little city on the island. And again, we'll go up from the outer islands up into the fjord. And again, we go there to see the scenery. Now, the town itself is a bit larger than Olden and has a tourist economy somewhat because people go there coming from ferries or ships to go up into the higher fjords. And the town itself is a little bigger, has modern housing, a marina, but I like this hotel which is in the shape of a sail. So an example of the design and modernization and new facilities, including the new library, which looks like a ship to me. But we're coming here for this sort of a scenery, the fantastic canyon lands and the upper lands of the fjordland. And you go up high enough, you get a pretty world view of the town where we were and all of the extent of the fjords and the mountains. And if you're a good hiker, you can follow this guy. He knows the best scene because this is sort of like it's an old saying among sheep, the world is not fair because it's not flat. But then there are over these different Grangerfjord and so on for all these pinnacle lookouts, which are sort of the goal of many hikers to go up there and get their picture taken. And many years ago, I went up high into the ice cap and glaciers and hiked over the Hardangerjökull, which is the big ice sheet on the high mountains. And with a friend, we wondered if we were lost in Siberia or something, but every few kilometers there'd be a little stocked house with food in it for the hikers, so you didn't have to carry your food. The Trail Association keeps these cabins up in the mountains in the summer so you can enjoy it. In the summertime, though, a lot of the snow's gone and you get these sort of alpine lakes and wetlands, and so this is the very top of the fjordland where we won't be going, but it as you see, it's sort of flat-topped in contrast to let's say the deep canyons that lead down to the sea. Now, incredibly, people moved into this area in prehistory and became the Norwegian people, let's say, but the original inhabitants were the Sami, who are a minority. They used to be called the Laplanders, but their own name is called Sami, and they have their own independent, autonomous communities in the far north, including Finland and over the border into Russia, where they herd the reindeer, and that's their livelihood. The meat, the hides. They're non-agricultural people. They are hunters and herdsmen, but they were, let's say, subjected to the national forces. But in Norway, they particularly have a whole town and a cultural center and representation in the nation. This is their reindeer tent. Now they're living in modern housing more because it's still cold. But they live up in the far north. We're not going to get to go there. But if we do, if you ever take a trip all the way up to the Nordkapp, which is the north point of Europe, this is what you'll see on a clear night. We may see some of this in Trondheim. There may be northern lights. We'll look out for them, but that's all up to the will of the sun god. Then we're going to Trondheim, which is the third largest city in Norway, and it's a trading town and actually a university center, and it's also the site of the coronation of the royal family. But it's a compact little town, sort of put on the banks of the Neva River, and then a modern port up here. We'll be docking the top of the screen, and then the excursions go into the old town and visit the cathedral and different sites around the town. But it's a very charming town just because there are canals and waters all around it. It's very walkable. This is where we'll be out on the sea, and so because it's a transportation center, there's not a walking waterfront as much as there are rail lines and port facilities. Some of the old fishing fleet is still there preserved. Most of the fishing has moved offshore now. But then if you go into the town, you get to see, this is the Gamla Brücke, the old gate bridge over the river to the old neighborhoods. And here's the typical warehouse now turned into housing. And you can see some Vikings are getting ready for their next raid. But this is a very nice town. It's just pleasant cafes and shops and things like this, and you can get around just by foot. And then there's whole new sections of it with modern housing. About 1/5 of the residents are students from the rest of Norway around the world, and it's the site of the Norwegian Technical University, where I have some colleagues who are working in marine propulsion. But they're all on their boat or in the cabin up the hill now. So like most of Norway, everybody goes on vacation for at least a couple of months while the weather's so good. And above the whole town is the Kristianstad Festing, which is the old fort to guard the town from sea raiders or over the hill raiders from the rest of Scandinavia. And this was where King Olaf, who was the king who led the unification of Norway and had battles, and he lost a battle with the Danish king and was killed and buried in Trondheim in the river. And then they took his body out. It was perfectly preserved, and then he was declared a saint because he promoted Christianity and unity of all of the tribal chiefs of Norway. And so he is now interned in the great cathedral, Domen, the Nidarosdomen, it's called in Norwegian. This is the most northern cathedral in Europe, and a very fantastic construction that began in the 11th century to honor who became Saint Olaf, and it features some 75 figurines across the great facade, the great rose window. So if you follow the reconstruction of Notre Dame, that sort of gives you the flavor of all the incredible architecture that it took and the community effort to make a fantastic cathedral like this. And here's one of the early bishops making an offering to the former gods. But they have preserved and kept this in such good shape. And it used to be called the gloomy cathedral because it had no lighting in it. And in the wintertime, there was so little light that it was sort of like going into this vast cave. Now they have installed a state-of-the-art lighting, so it's very spectacular. Here's the rose window and the great organ. So if we're fortunate, we'll be able to hear that if you go visit the cathedral in our brief visit. And then below are the crypts with the tomb of Olaf and other royalty. And the tradition in Norway is if you were crowned the new king, then you go to Trondheim Cathedral because that's the seat of the royalty. So this has a lot of history to it, and you can almost hear the ghosts of the past. Particularly you might hear one of these, which is the great ceremonial trumpet of Norse time. It's called a lar. And this was a sort of a valveless trumpet that kind of spooked the spirits of the time. I'm going to sort of segue into music because Trondheim and the rest of Norway has a great musical tradition, particularly distinctive in certain areas, different than others back when people didn't travel so much. And the great composer Edvard Grieg took these and made symphonic poems and choral music and such, so he's sort of the national composer of the spirit of Norway. But here you have a lot of youth learning to play and pop musicians, and this is the life of the country. Music is, particularly in the wintertime, it's a great comfort, unless you get outside, which is the other great activity in Norway is out skiing. And I have friends who go over the mountains and through the dales and ski jumping, and so this is a very athletic and recreational-minded nation, and with a lot of international Olympic contenders, and some who just like to have fun. And speaking of which, as a sailor, I have to segue to where it's not so much fun, because the North Sea, as we're getting a little taste of today, can get famously rough. And so you can imagine if you worked on a ship in this kind of conditions, fishing or else on the oil rigs and all that, you can appreciate the maritime determination of the Norsemen and of old and the Norwegians now. Per capita, there are more sailors and more ships in Norway than most parts of the world. And they have to know what they're doing because they come into things like this, the great tidal sweeps, the tidal bores. This is the kind of tide that a modern ship can just go through, but back in the days of sail and row, you had to know what you're doing. And I've had Norwegians friends who say, no, these things are true. There are maelstroms. This is off of a 1600 chart, and small craft do go out, and they do get caught and taken down by, other neighbors. Yes, don't say the name. Well, they actually do exist, because just off Norway is one of the deepest abysses as in the Atlantic general zone, and there are giant squid down there. Maybe not quite that big, but maybe they're nicer. So you just have to, make do and have a friend to help save you if you really need help. Well, back in the medieval times, the North was considered a wild and dangerous place just because of the seas and the mountains and the people. And so here's an early description of the spirits and the kind of mythological people living trees and giant birds and giant squids and such. But this chronicle also said the people up here are particularly skilled at making boats, which is the Viking tradition, of course. And so every little town would have a boatyard and make what you can still see some of the clinker-built boats in the harbors here. But they were mostly for trading. They would have woolen goods, furs, forest products, timber, and they would trade it to the south, wherever that was, just the next bay or the next islands, Britain or France, and then they would import things like wine and brandy and stuff they didn't make. And actually in the 1200s, the Bishop of Trondheim banned alcohol because it was causing so much trouble. And then they had a rebellion amongst the fishermen. How can we go fish if we don't have a little brandy? And to this day, the state owns and distributes all the liquor in the country. And it used to be you had to get a medical certificate to be able to buy any liquor, and pregnant women were not allowed to buy liquor because that's maybe what got them pregnant. I don't know. But anyway, the heritage is deeply underground because this is one of a series of fortresses. Happens to be in Denmark. But they've been excavating things and finding more and more treasures from the earlier centuries. This is a boat burial in Scotland. We'll see one of these at the museum in Oslo. But out of these tombs and other archaeological sites, I get a glimpse of the life of the people back hundreds of years ago. These are combs made out of walrus ivory, and here's a ceremonial cup. Norway and the rest of Scandinavia has iron ore and copper deposits, so much of what's left is actually the metallurgy, which goes on as a modern industry too. Here's the god Tyr, who's the guardian of sailors and other people who wear it as an amulet around their neck. And they've been finding more and more of these sort of treasure chests in the burials. Many of the materials have very fine metalwork and filigree tracing. So this is the high age of, let's say, this kind of inlay, gold and silver. And of course, these were expensive things, often as gifts between the people in different areas or the king. And they said that because the Norse via Sweden went to Russia all the way down the rivers to Ukraine and finally to Baghdad and Constantinople, they also took in some of the metallurgy skills of the Middle East, which are seen in some of these designs. But most famously, they made these fantastic copper helmets with chain mail. If we had a costume party, that's what I'd wear, if I could find it. But these are, again, an example of the warlike nature in the past. Not that we have any problems like that today, but here's one of the great gods, Olden, the blind in one eye, wise man who was the source of what they call the Havama, which are the true sayings of Odin, which are sort of aphorisms and proverbs from ancient Norse history. And I'll just show you a few of the gods. Thor, son of Odin and the strongest god, and he was always called to in battle, and he's holding on his hammer. Now we remember him every Thursday, named Thorsdag. And here's some of his hammer that he could smite the ground, cause earthquakes, cut fjords, and had magical powers. Here's Helgar, who's the messenger between the worlds and the gods. And here again is Tyr, who's somehow chaining up a giant wolf. So these things come up in a lot of the mythology is now being confirmed by some of the archaeology. This is a carving on a church, actually, of Sigmund and Regin, who were characters in what they call the Volsung saga, which became the Ring of the Nibelung and Wagnerian operas. And so here they are pounding and making the magical sword they'll use in battle. Here's a chariot dragon head. This again is a museum in Oslo. You may see the real thing. And here's the Jomungand, which is the snake that surrounds the world, and it is sort of the carrier of all life forward. And it's in runic designs also, the world serpent, they call it. They've also found a remarkable sort of bronze chariot pulling a golden sun. So this goes back so far that they think it's actually prehistoric religion of worship the sun, as we all still do. And there's emblems in the design of the swirling sun. That's a motif in Norse design. Here's a clasp with the interlocking metal that sort of represents the interconnectedness of everybody and everything. And here's can you guess what it is? No, it's a breastplate. It said the women wore those to show their wealth. Sounds uncomfortable to me. And here's what they call the Yggdrasil, or the world tree, which is the ever-growing tree of life. And it's always being eaten by birds and rats, but it keeps growing, and it's also the tree that descends into hell, a good Norse word, all the way up to Valhalla, the heaven, and we are in the middle of the tree of life. So there's a lot of this written down in extensive mythology. If you have time, if we have the book, or you can look it up, there's tale after tale, because back in the good old days, you had no screens or distractions to keep your mind occupied. And these tales and these designs sort of carried on for 1,000 more years. Here's a modern door with the tree of life on it. And in death, they often had a common grave under a stone, or some warriors in particular were given a Viking send-off in their boat. That's a one-way trip, I think, on a ship. But others were ceremonially sacrificed to the gods, and famously the bogmen in Denmark were cast into the mud, and then they have been preserved remarkably. A lot of the old culture is only known because of the runic stones and the writing system that developed alphabetically. It can actually be read in what they call the Farther language. And so you can make it out, and this is where linguists have a field day figuring out what they are. They're mostly memorials to events or people without much literature. That was always oral. But here's an example of a gravestone, and in the runic alphabet it said, "To our sons, one went east to Russia, and one went west to Iceland, and neither of them returned." But that's what happened. So you find these in many places. They're often painted red. The original stones often had blood as coloring, and that washed off, so now they trace it out so you can see it clearly. But this is an example where the old and the new Christian religion sort of merged somewhat and continued the tradition. Here's a modern gravestone in a village in one of the fjordland, and they keep finding more. This is one that was on a big stone face and has a boat, Viking boat on it, and the language. This was just uncovered a couple of years ago, and they're still figuring out what it says. But guess where they found it? Ontario, Canada. But there have been a few. Anybody from Minnesota, you find that in your backyard. Everybody has one. Right? Well, anyway, I'm going to continue on just to say some of the linguistically, we still use a lot of Norse in English along with French and German words, but here's just a list of some of the words you use every day and you didn't know you spoke Norse. It's a thing. The only day of the week we don't use Norses is Saturday. That was renamed after the Roman god. But window used to be the eye of the wind, which is where you'd have a opening in the top of a roof just to let the smoke out. And we now put glass over it and have a view, but that's what the original meaning of a window. A husband means a housemate, and every wife should have a knife, etc. Go berserk. That's actually refers to the bare shirt in Norse, and that's when the Viking warriors would get in their bare shirt and get a little drunk, and then they'd go spreading peace and love. And all these other things, particularly in shipping, there's all kinds of words on the right side. Island, or island, actually means the land of ice, like the island we call Iceland. Slave actually refers to the Slavic people that were in Eastern Europe that would be enslaved and sold markets, and trust and thrift and thunder and lightning. So you could make up a whole story just out of the vocabulary. And I'm going to just summarize with the heritage about the pride and the confidence, the individualism, the egalitarianism. I mean, Norway is one of the least unequal countries in the world, where most other places are getting extreme ends of wealth and poverty. Norway and the rest of Scandinavia is fairly socially engineered. Everybody is taken care of. And they also the spirit of adventure, exploration, trade, entrepreneurial things, and democracy. The Althing is still the oldest parliament in the world. They don't call it, that's actually the old name. It's still the name of the parliament in Iceland. And human rights, one thing I read here, put there is allmansrecht. That means everyone's right, including the right to walk across anybody else's property, as long as you don't steal anything. And women's right, traditionally the women have had an equal position in property ownership and leadership in the society. And the last thing I said is the price of prosperity, because Norway has become a prosperous place. They have a sovereign state fund fed by the oil industry, which has paid ahead 3 generations of all education, medical costs, retirement. And so this is the, let's say, an ideal that some of us from other parts of the world can't imagine. Well, anyway, the world goes on. And maybe some of you had Norse ancestors, I do, and so that when the Norse crossed over to Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, and then later as immigrants to Canada, the United States, and around the world, they became a significant influence around the world. And I always grew up with this cartoon. I see Sven and Gretel have come back together after ironing out their differences. How did that happen? She hit him with her iron. And that reminds me of the old story about the Viking warrior comes back for the winter to stay home, and the wife says, how was your summer vacation? Oh dear, just more pillage and raping. I'm so tired of it. And welcome home. And then he comes back drunk, and she starts berating him. Said, you no good husband. Yeah, I'll teach you a lesson here. And he jumps under the bed. And she says, come out and get the beating you deserve. And from under the bed he says, I'm the man in the house. I'm in charge, and I will not come out from under the bed and get the beating I deserve. Anyway, we're going to have a wonderful time seeing these fantastic places and appreciating the culture. I'll be talking more about shipbuilding, navigation, and whatever else I find. But I'll leave you just a couple more views, because there's not much to say when you can look out your suite and go up in the mountains and see the drama of this great land. And if you're very adventuresome, you can hike all the way there, but just watch your step. And here's the bravest of all hikers. And he's sort of at the top of the world, that's all. So I'm going to leave you a couple of other just sayings about the sea. This is from Alfred Noyes. There's magic in the distance where the sea line meets the sky. And the earth and ocean seem to sleep in one another's arms and dream together. That's Shelley. And the heart is but the beach beside the sea that is the world. And with the last few, this is Nordkapp on the far north end of Norway, the northernmost part of Europe, and looking up to the Arctic Ocean. And maybe someday we'll all get up there on another troop, but that's very far away because it's another 1,000 kilometers north. But I wish you a great trip and welcome to Norway, and see you around the ship. Thank you very much.